Layman Pascal is another smart guy. There's lots of them around. He's into integral theory and metamodernism, which is like stage past traditional modernism, postmodernism, metamodernism, or integral, roughly. And in this video, he's talking about wholeness and the non-rational and liminality. And David Fuller's adding in crisis. And I want to focus on liminality and crisis, so we're starting halfway through. So let's go.
Do you want to talk about what you've learned doing those and maybe point people towards some of your favorite episodes?
So he's talking about Layman Pascal's podcast or YouTube channel called The Integral Stage, I think it is.
Very hard for me to think of favorite episodes. I have a few least favorites, but in general, each one is so different. I have such fun just getting into it with somebody.
I think there's two motivations behind what these integral sort of guys are doing, integral theory sort of guys are doing. One is just out of interest, like pursuing their interests and potentials. And the other one is, solving the world's problems. So I don't see how wholeness and gathering together all these human potentials is going to solve our problems. I mean, because those potentials are infinite. And same with the non-rational. Very unlikely that the answer's going to pop up from somewhere non-rational. And even then it would be interpreted by the rational aspect of us. And most of our progress has been due to, rationality, thinking things through, finding weaknesses in thought and analysing possibilities. Another problem is you're not going to get everybody on the same page. If our potentials are infinite and the answers requires gathering all those potentials, the answer to the world's problems requires gathering all those potentials, we'll never get to the end of it. And I don't think it's necessary. We've just got to find out the mistakes we're making, and that's not really a mystery. It's we've just got to dig below the surface. I'll go into that a bit more later.
Most importantly, is a visceral sense of the richness of the topology of the whole landscape.
Yeah, see, it's endlessly fascinating, right? If you're into exploring it as an interest or as a potential, but you're not going to get the answers. And that they've already got a heap of things that they're interested in, and he says there's much, much more.
One of the things we deliberately set out to do was to take some risks, and also to not focus on just big name author, presenter, lecturers, right? That's the temptation when you're doing it.
Also, it's great to take risks, and also the big name authors are likely to be pretty mainstream. So they're going to give answers that are kind of societally approved. Because to be a big name author, you need an audience, and since everybody's pretty much aligned with the basics of society, you only become a big name author if you're telling people what they want to hear, what they think is already true.
And as much as I love Steve McIntosh, how many times can you interview Steve McIntosh about his new book? I also want to hear about somebody who just is at home and loves metamodernism, or like everybody in the field, or somebody who's been ejected from a bunch of Game B groups. That's very interesting too.
Yeah, well, I've been ejected from quite a few. Basically it's like Christianity or something. If you've got to believe in all their ideas before they'll listen to you, and if they disagree with you, they tell you got to keep reading their theory, but you'd only keep reading it if you believe it. Same with the Bible, point out a fault in the Bible or something, and they'll go, well, you've just got to read more of the Bible. So it becomes like an institution in that regard, institutions like dinosaurs that want to protect themselves, It becomes like a survival pattern. And if you're very invested in your belief system, then you don't want it criticised. And the whole reason for these groups, like online groups for integral theory or whatever, is that everyone agrees with it and they just want to explore it more and unpack it more and add discoveries to it. They don't want people coming in to question it, right? I don't question like the basic ideas of them. Integral theory's got some amazing ideas in it, but I'm questioning things like, will it work, and what's the unquestioned assumptions behind a lot of it, that sort of thing. People don't want to do that. Immediately eject people that question things like that. And this is going to lead into the crisis aspect and the liminality aspect we're going to talk about in a minute.
What are all the types of people and all the types of thinking that's making one of the extended liminal web?
No, it's endless.
We don't know. I think one of the things that's gone on here that's difficult, right? I co-facilitated this session that Bjorkman was very interested in mapping and naming the field. And one of the things I was trying to bring up there is, do we have enough experience of what the field is to be able to map and name it, right? There's different modes. So Joe Lightfoot was pointing out like how we can take the feeling of the shared intersubjective field more seriously. But what I wanted to say was, well, have we asked it what its name is, right? What if we switch into a second person mode? What if we switch into a number of different kinds of modes? So it's the same kind of thing with the integral stage.
Well, you could say that it's the unknown or gradually becoming known aspects of our potential. The liminality aspect is about thresholds and stepping out of one mode but not having stepped into a new mode yet. So it's like the unknown.
If we can have a much broader, take the risk of having a much wider sense of who all the people are and all the things they want to bring up, even if it bothers us sometimes, because we talk to people who bother other people, then we'd be in a position to start to name it. But before that, if you're just going to the conference and talking to the right people, it's too limited a sample size to even know what this event is.
And you talked about mapping the space, the field, and there's various names. The Liminal Web article, I think, by Joe Lightfoot was probably the best way of kind of identifying. Let's put it this way, there is a there.
Yeah, obviously there's much more to reality than we're aware of. And there's a lot more to our potentials than we're aware of. So yes, there's a there. The question is are we exploring it out of interest, or do we think it's going to solve all our problems? Exploring it out of interest, I think, is perfectly valid and good, but assuming or hoping that it will solve all our problems, I think it's highly questionable. And I think simple inquiry can help us see what our problems are, how we create unhappiness. I mean, it's obvious. We create unhappiness by dominating others, by chasing material gain or spiritual gain or social gain. And we think that way because society's programmed us into thinking that way since birth. Society says we're lacking and flawed, and we've got to fill the lack with gain, and we've got to fix the flaws by policing ourselves and others and judging, and that leads to all kinds of distractions, and we never get to the real issues.
There's enough of a there for people to know what we're talking about when we start kind of talking about the conversation, or how would you characterize it, and where would you sort of not necessarily draw the boundaries, but how would you identify and how would you describe the space?
Yeah, I love Joe's term because it saves me time. I don't have to always go, well, integral and meta monitoring, game B and Bildung and also for Vakey's people and all, so liminal.
So it's endless. I mean, is it like a lottery? We just keep entering into the unknown and hope that we pull out the answers,
Well, covers all that. I made a map coming in for thinking about this, and Bjorkman threw it up on the slide, but he covered the central section, and what I'd named it was x.liminal.web, because X is unknown, because X is former, we're always moving on from the terms we come up with for ourselves, but also X because it's extended. It's not just the people in the podcast space or the conference space, it's all of whatever we're doing. And the reason liminality is a great word for that is the same reason I put so much focus on the metaphysics of adjacency. It's this notion of this in-betweenness, and whether it's trying to work on subjective in-betweenness of sharing, or it's trying to work on make greater harmony between the parts of the individual, or whether you're looking at building a new cosmology that's connection and relationship oriented.
You see, all that, it's like attempting wholeness, right? By piecing all the bits together, all the potentials together. But is it discovered, or is it created, or is it like uncovered? Like, is it already there? So what we are and what reality is already there. It might be in seed form, like in potentials, but I think the main thing is to see what is dividing us, what is narrowing us to begin with, what is limiting us to begin with. Focus on that rather than sort of hurdling that and just jumping to try and gathering everything together. So I think these kind of guys are often, I think they're extroverted intuition in the Myers-Briggs personality theory. So they're interested in lots of different ideas. They can't get enough of it, and it just goes on forever. And I think that's great as an assumption, as a potential to explore those potentials. But thinking the answers there is like skipping over the stage of, hang on, what am I doing and why am I doing it? What's the assumption? What's the motivation? What are the contexts?
There's all these notions of interconnectivity and betweenness and thresholds. And when you get a sense that these are people who, in their ability to think, orient towards some version of that, and are able to emotionally make peace with that, because those can be strange and disturbing spaces.
Yeah, you've got to get comfortable with uncomfortable feelings. They're only uncomfortable in the beginning. Once you let them be there and let yourself feel them, then it's fine. And a good way to do that is to see that they're inevitable, and that if you run away from them, then you'll stay on the run forever.
And if you learn that you can inhabit some version of a liminal space and get comfortable with that, then suddenly you've crossed a threshold and you're one of these people. And
now, the interesting question there is, like in like the liminal theory of like in anthropology, is the idea of that there's a liminal stage between your previous social identity and a new identity, like from childhood to adulthood. There's this in-between space. And the point of the liminality is to keep going and to get to a new social identity. But I think we should just stay in the liminal space. Stay in the unknown, as the unknown, because, ultimately we know that life's a mystery. Consciousness is a mystery, the universe is a mystery. Where did it come from? Where is it? Is it in relationship to God or other universes? It's a way beyond our capacity to understand, at least for now. So, and what's the assumption that we need to go to a new social identity or a new worldview or whatever? It's the assumption is that we're dependent on those things, but we're not. Our happiness is not dependent on anything except, survival basics. It's not dependent on material gain, social gain, spiritual gain, personal growth, intellectual maps.
There are lots of people doing that who aren't in this direct web yet. You can see it all over. So on that map, I said, there's people who are doing leading edge transdisciplinary science. Great. There's also people doing shamanic and, Tibetan Buddhist exploration of Bardo states as the center of their, halfway things, right? There's a lot of integrative health practitioners who not only are like, how do all these different modalities work together, but very often they're, how do the hemispheres of the brain work? How do the bits of the spine line up? They're very focused on these interstitial zones.
Yeah, I'm interested in the Bardo states, and I'd love to find, if there's ever a permanent end to suffering, if life is eternal, if we are somehow eternal spirit souls. I'd like to find if there's a permanent end to suffering, but I don't think anyone's really found that as far as I can tell. So I think exploring that directions makes sense. I mean, it's going to be terrible if we keep reincarnating or something into bad planets or something. But then, we can create, maybe one day do like Elon Musk says and, spread out through the galaxies, our species out through the galaxies. Hopefully we create some sort of, we're free of illusion when we do that, which would be utopia. Then if anyone gets reincarnated on another planet, or this planet or another planet, then it's going to be good.
Very often they're, how do the hemispheres of the brain work? How do the bits of the spine line up? They're very focused on these interstitial zones as the structural heart of where they think the action is and where the energy comes from. That's my sense of what they all have in common, is that kind of structural analysis on the in-between and the emotional capacity to not be put off by that. And when you get that shift, then you start to sense there's a real power, there's a potential downstream of starting to focus on the next twos and the in-betweens.
I guess to make it a little bit more personal for me and connecting to that sort of idea of liminality, Rebel Wisdom obviously played some role in mapping, cohering this conversation to some degree, featuring many of the people. And as you know, Rebel Wisdom is going to be wrapping up at the end of the year. And that, for me, was a very liminal experience of actually dropping in. I was feeling a little bit creatively kind of stuck, and I went to India and I did a lot of breath work with a amazing facilitator that I know. And breath work's kind of one of my main practices to tap into what I would call liminality, or whatever the vertical is, whatever the vertical is.
I wrote a screenplay about a guy called The Verticalist. It's about somebody who's always looking to get higher and higher, because that's kind of the hope of society. I mean, if one thing doesn't satisfy you, you move on to the next thing and keep trying, going higher and higher. But you've got to learn the pattern that none of those things are going to work. And it's interesting to see what David's going to go into here. Is he talking about just finding a new career or a new direction in his career, or is it a crisis about his lifestyle and worldview? And that's a general question for society and for people in society is, when one thing ends, do we jump onto the next thing, or do we let it become a crisis and let it go deeper, and do we question our assumptions and motivations and find a greater freedom?
And it really dropped in that it was time to let go of this particular incarnation of this journey, that rebellion wasn't appropriate. And
rebellion's the best thing. Well, rebellion's needed right now, but it's not rebellion against everything. It's rebelling against society's assumption that human beings are faulty or weak or flawed. Just like giraffes. There's nothing wrong with giraffes. There's nothing wrong with stars. There's nothing wrong with trees. It's all amazing. But somehow we believe that humans are the one bad thing in the universe or something. It's crazy. It just doesn't stand up to logic. I mean, it's not statistically likely.
And I'm sort of feeling into that. It's still a very uncomfortable place, because it does feel like a kind of death process in a way of giving up something that's been so core to my identity for the...
Bingo. Right, so that's more like crisis. I'm still not clear where David's at, well, but you just use these ideas as an example for anybody. Is it a crisis, or is it just a change in direction? When something old fades out, is it just leading to a change of direction, or is it a crisis? So my experience was, I was searching for a career, I think 20 years or something, and I just kept failing. And it's good. It turns out the best thing is if you're a total failure, because then you're forced to go deep. You're forced into a crisis, right? But somebody like David is very successful and effective in the world. They can keep going from one thing to another forever, and they'll never get to the core issues, because you keep getting rewarded, through your success in the world. Anyway, so I found myself in a job I hated, and I was had a big debt, and I was miserable, and so I quit. Even though I had a big debt, I quit, and I went to Byron Bay, which is like the main spiritual town in Australia. And I was going to write books and screenplays and songs, but I could see after a few weeks it wasn't going to work. So I had no money and debt and no job and even accommodation. I was staying at a backpacker's place, It was a real crisis. And but it led to a breakthrough, like a breakthrough spiritual experience, but also a breakthrough in understanding, seeing that everything I do is going to be chasing an unreliable form of happiness. And it's like kind of inevitable. That's what we'll do when we're disconnected from our innate happiness. So, and if you look, other people, like Buddha supposedly had a crisis when he was crossing the river, and he'd been practicing, starvation techniques, and he nearly drowned. And that brought a breakthrough, and Krishnamurti's brother died, and that led to a crisis, and Ramana Maharshi had a death experience. So crisis seems to be needed in this world, and I'd say that's because, from childhood, when we're vulnerable and open, we just absorb everything society says, Society says you need to make material, spiritual or social gain to be happy, So we absorb that, and we're surrounded by it for the rest of our lives. Like, everybody believes that. Like, maybe not gain, maybe some people believe in maintenance, like the conservatives just want to maintain, the progressives want to improve, and but it's some form of dependence either way, which distracts us away from innate happiness, you see. So because we're surrounded by it, everyone believes it, it seems there needs to be a shock, to something to break us out of it. So that's why I think crisis seems to be necessary at the moment. But in a wiser world, first off, we wouldn't go into illusion by definition, because the world's wise and we won't make the mistake, or we won't be brainwashed into it, that belief. And also, being surrounded by wise people would obviously be very beneficial. But in the current world, it seems like crisis is needed, unless there's some wise person around that I don't know about, Most of the wise people supposedly wise people, are already aligned with some belief system, non-duality or religion or mindfulness or psychotherapy or something.
For the last 4 or 5 years, and I can't say that I haven't had sort of back and forth moments of like, really, is this? And some people telling me that it's a really terrible idea to stop it.
Yeah, I mean, they got 250,000 subscribers. I mean, I think that's more than CNN or something, you know. Those old cable networks are falling away. It takes a lot to build up a YouTube channel, and I don't think they should cancel it. I think there was a great... they had a guest interviewer, I think it was blonde hair colour or something, but he had asked amazing questions, so maybe just get him to continue it on and just keep it more open, the agenda more open, rather than trying to narrow it down into collective sense-making, which is like a vague hope that that'll lead to saving the world.
So yeah, I'm interested in maybe if you've got any reflections on that process and thoughts on maybe the role of rebel wisdom and where you think that this may be going, and any advice for me.
Yeah, interesting question.
Well, my advice for somebody in that where David's at, well, it depends again. Is it just a career direction change thing, or is it a real crisis? I think because we're in a world that pushes us to gain happiness or maintain happiness, we're just going to keep wasting our time until we let it fall away and become a crisis. So long as you're in a safe country and you've got some money and security, you know, the basics are fulfilled. You need, as long as you've got those, then let it become a crisis. But even that, it's hard to know, because a person, there's no guarantee that you're going to find an answer or find wisdom through the crisis. So that can be tricky. But all that's really happening in the crisis is you're letting go of the attachment to some form of dependence. You're letting go of the dependence. Your happiness is not dependent on maintenance or gain of material, social, political, spiritual, personal growth, intellectual maps, whatever. Our happiness is not dependent. If it is dependent, then it's going to be miserable, because subconsciously we know anything that's gained can be lost. It also becomes stale. So, and luckily, happiness is innate to being, so we can let those things go. And then they become just an interest, like Layman Pascal's interest in various emerging potentials. Then that's icing on the cake rather than something we're dependent on.
I won't say that everybody's loved rebel wisdom, but everybody's taken it seriously. So I really respect the contribution that you've made.
Yeah.
I like the story of where the choice comes from. And you are in an in-between space now. I think when I first saw you the other night, I thought, this looks like a guy who just got divorced.
So that is just so great. I mean, it's, you know, people go for decades before they get to that stage of, hang on, what's going on? Of, you know, asking the most fundamental questions. But I'm not saying David's there, but and society's got to come to that stage. I mean, we've achieved a lot, and now we have security and time to go back and question basic societal assumptions, you know. It's a great opportunity, but I'm not seeing anyone willing to do it, unfortunately.
I guess there's a lot of energy, a lot of options. You're not sure. You're still connected. You're still grieving. What's the next thing? All that space. Very rich. All right. So I would say lean into that as much as you can. Allow yourself emotionally to be as open and as undecided and as in between as this affords you.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Let that become its own kind of coherence.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, Zach and I came in together from the Wild Vessel encampment, and we had a lot of discussion about decision making, right? And in decision making, if you do it right, if you're pondering, right, and you're going back and forth between things, and you are operating between these different systems in yourself that are leaning in different ways, and most people don't intentionally put the time in to wrestle with that. But if you spend that time going back and forth, weighing it, analyzing with different parts of your being, those bits touch each other more and more across that.
So he's talking about career change there, making a decision. So that's very different from allowing crisis to push us deeper into questioning our lifestyle, down world views. So first I would, if somebody was asking me the question, what should I do? I would get clarity on that first. Are you just looking for career change, or are you looking for deeper self-understanding and understanding of life?
That liminal gap. And then when they click in, then you go, oh, that feels great. I'm more organized and I've made a decision. There's no possible way I could get outside myself and objectively know, but I know it is my decision now.
Well, you can know your motivations and assumptions. You just look. So we can get objectivity about that.
I've made it. This is what I'm going to do. And that's tremendously liberating. And it gives you a kind of buzz, which all...
Yeah, we shouldn't be looking for a buzz. You mentioned earlier in the interview something about meditation buzzes and things like that. And deeper feeling of myself and things like that. That's already a motivation, a questionable motivation, you see. Are we dependent on those things or not? If we're dependent, then we're like drug addicts. And it turns out, if you inquire deep enough, you see that we're not dependent on anything. And yeah.
All good meditation should give you, because it's brought many parts of yourselves together and they've become a better team.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what you're talking...
So why should meditation give us a buzz? Nope.
About kind of the subconscious or the non-rational is something I'm feeling quite viscerally at the moment, because I can rationally believe that whatever comes next will be, that something will come along, that it will be an expansion rather than a contraction of moving on from rebel.
So that's when I was going through my crisis, that was I was thinking like that as well. I tried things like trust. So I thought to myself, well, if I can't find a career, which was obviously proven that I couldn't because it was 20 years of searching and total failure, thorough failure. If I can't find it, then I'm not going to do it. And instead, I'll trust, which is... So then I looked at trust. I thought, well, hang on, why am I trusting? Well, I'm trusting because I'm hoping that trust will give me a career. So I was still a contaminated motivation, and it's always going to be like that whenever you think you're dependent. So I even had to let go of trust, and that just means complete. So not only closing off my active career search, my conscious career search, and my normal way of searching for a career, not only cutting that off, but also not letting a new approach to it come in, a sneaky new approach to come in. Because that's what we keep moving from thing to thing in this world, because we don't question our motivation for searching and pursuit of various forms of happiness. We just, if one's not working, we just move to another one and keep moving and bouncing around. So we stay constantly distracted from the fundamental questions.
Wisdom, but at the same time, my body and my emotions are not necessarily feeling that, and are really feeling the visceral nature of like, well, what the fuck? How am I gonna survive? How am I gonna get my kind of living needs met? All of these different things, and that's a really interesting place to be, and it does feel like a kind of death process in a lot of ways.
Well, so it's moving into crisis, away from career search into crisis. When you're talking about death and vulnerability, that raises the stakes and makes it a crisis.
So in a way, it doesn't matter how much I kind of think from a kind of rational place that it's going to be fine, it's going to unfold. It really feels like a kind of leap into the unknown in that way.
The processing will take as long as it takes, but learning to be more graceful at grieving is something we all need to do, right? In order to bring the rest of our system along with us, and as a species.
And the funny thing about that is, as soon as you accept that it's inevitable, then you can face it. Until you think, well, ever you think there's an escape hatch somewhere, you'll be running and afraid.
We haven't been doing that very well, right? As a Western modern civilization, we've been doing it very poorly.
Yes.
And as we stand in front of your situation, echoes the larger situation.
Yes.
Right? We're all moving on from feeling like this civilization has been working, and we don't know what's going to come. And if we're emotionally caught up in the situation, if we haven't grieved our way through it, if we haven't allowed ourselves to be worried and disappointed and uncertain, then we're not going to be showing up to the point where we might be able to play a part in the solution. I don't even want to call it the solution, but
yeah, that's great. That's exactly right. Everyone thinks they know the answers, and they're fighting each other over the answers. And they're all coming from the same assumptions, that humans are lacking and flawed. So, and the assumption of dependence that follows from that.
In order to figure out how we go forward with coherence, we have to let it take the time it takes and let our hearts break as much as they want to break, and also build skill at that, because there's going to be so many reasons to descend and drop and break and grieve, and our energy has to be able to go all the way down if it's going to come back up.
Yeah,
and there's something about attuning to that. I mentioned in February the breath work, and it was one of the most intensely visceral feelings of kind of just learning to tune that kind of sense of alignment inside. And
that I'm not sure what he means by that, but alignment, because we're always off balance whenever we're pursuing an illusion. Something's always something. Subconsciously, we know that we're on the wrong track, or that it can't work, or that it's unreliable if we achieve what we're seeking, and so we're always off balance. And it's really alignment with being, alignment with who we really are, rather than having what we think we are versus what we are. We're just getting rid of what we think we are and just being. That's a real alignment. And when the energy is no longer directed outwards towards some goal, spiritual, material goal, or social goal, or whatever, whatever we're leaning out, our energy's going out that way, then we're out of alignment. And then when that stops, the alignment happens, and then very interesting things happen.
And become more and more familiar with it, and kind of using emotions and using the felt sense as a kind of compass. And that moment of kind of dropping in is like, oh, it's actually maybe time to let go of this, and letting go of the energetic connection and attachment to the project felt like it's the most intensely visceral shift I've ever experienced, in a way of like, oh, and then a lot of creativity unblocked, a lot of kind of freedom came from that.
That's great, but if it's a crisis rather than just a career change, If it's a crisis, you want to be careful about new things replacing the old things.
And learning to kind of navigate. You're familiar with the inquiry work and the diamond essence work.
Yeah, that diamond stuff's a bit. I had a look; it's a bit vague. I think we just need to focus on what's our motivations and assumptions. Question them.
But that would be another dialogos in John Vervaeke's terms. I think is another like essential skill to start to attune to that thing that wants to emerge in ourselves and in the space between us, and that's
that thing that wants to emerge. There's hope creeping in there. Again, if it's a career thing, something might want to emerge, or some pursuit of potential or interest. But if it's a crisis, or if we're getting to reality, nothing wants to really emerge as far as I can see. What wants to happen is the relinquishment of illusion, the attachments to unreliable forms of happiness.
Essentially a non-rational process as well.
Yeah, the conscious mind's there, but it's only one of the participants. Inquiry is great. I would say keep an eye open for unexpected opportunities. Say yes to things that surprise you.
Yeah, so you don't, if it's a crisis, you don't want to replace something with new opportunities. You don't want to replace illusions with new opportunities, because they're likely to be just continuations of illusion, especially if they're coming from society.
During the transition, if there's little bits of ritual ordeal opportunities that you come across, take those.
No.
But also, you're talking to me.
Well, we're not dependent. See, this line of thinking is like, you're alone and you've got to hope for some passing life raft to grab onto, But that's based on the assumption that you're dependent on those life rafts, and that staying where you are is actually not the best thing. You're assuming that it's not the best thing. You're assuming that you need something. We don't need anything. We are not dependent. Happiness is not dependent, apart from basics like survival basics and freedom from illusion. We're dependent on that, sort of.
You're talking to Greg, but spend as much time with your elders as you can, whoever you consider them to really be.
Well, who are these elders? You can have an elder career-wise, like if you're a musician, you might have a music teacher or whatever. But I don't see anyone calling people out of society's illusions. No elders doing that that I've seen anywhere. They're all aligned with some aspect of the illusion.
That's been on my mind a lot lately. Because, what does this field become? How do we instantiate it more? It's going to have some of the characteristics of a tribe. It calls itself a tribe or a collection of tribes all the time, but it's not really doing the necessary things a tribe does.
Well, tribes are dangerous, because they've always got a culture and a lifestyle, a belief system.
One of the things a tribe does is it polarizes this relationship between people and their elders. And the elders, I've been talking to the older people here, and they don't necessarily want to think of themselves as elders, right? And they're not that old, and they're vital, and they're ongoing. That's why we want to consider them elders, because they are still lively. But they've seen these things move through a lot of layers, and they hold a space that is the space we're going toward. And when we...
Hang on, what's this space we're going toward? What happened to being comfortable with the unknown?
Venerate them as elders, we set ourselves on a path to be the elders we might become.
Who wants to be an elder? This is a kind of assumption of progress and dependence. I'm dependent on the elders, and then one day I'm going to be the elder and everyone's going to be dependent on me. This is not true. We are not dependent. Society says we're dependent, and that's the illusion that's got to be questioned.
And it creates this possibility of movement and flow through in the community. So whenever you have a chance to talk to anybody who's been doing this longer than you, do what you're doing right now. Ask for hints. Even if they tell you something that's meaningless, what they transmit to you underneath that might be important, might be a nutrient you need.
My experience as a set of crisis anyway is that everything falls away. You don't get new ideas from other people. It's like constantly negating, seeing the false, and then, well, once you see it, you might have to do a little bit of effort to break habits of thinking in terms of the false, but generally the basic idea is it falls away, especially when you get like past like a 50% level, like when you're more in reality than illusion, then the rest of it falls away by itself. You might have to make a little bit of effort to get to that halfway point because of the habits and the pressures from society and the influence of society. But beyond that, it's about falling away, and it falls away by itself if you're once you're inquiring and interested in reality. I think we'll leave it there. That's where, from now on, he's going to talk about all these millions of other things that he's busy with. I mean, it's so endless, if you're jumping from one interest to another and one potential to another. Because our potentials are infinite in number, not in size. We can't create a universe or anything. But we have an infinite number of potentials, so we can stay busy with that forever. Anyway, thanks for watching.